I am Howard Collins, 71 years old and a retired structural engineer. I spent 40 years of my life calculating load-bearing walls, stress points, and foundations, ensuring that the structures I built could withstand any storm or seismic shift. Yet the most catastrophic structural failure of my entire life was the son I raised under my own roof. I pulled into my driveway on a Tuesday afternoon and found my wife of 40 years, Diane, standing at our wrought iron gate. She was trembling, crying silently, and holding a single leather overnight bag. My own son Colin had just told her that the house belonged to him now, and that she needed to leave the premises immediately. I did not scream. I did not drop to my knees. I simply walked up to my wife, picked up her bag, and walked her right back inside the house. Then I initiated a sequence of events that would systematically dismantle his entire world. Before I tell you exactly how I destroyed the empire my son thought he stole, let me know which city and state you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe right now if you believe that betraying your own family should come with devastating, irreversible consequences. The collapse did not happen overnight. It was a slow, agonizing erosion of boundaries that began 2 years prior. We had made the fatal mistake of allowing Colin and his new wife Brooke to move into the newly remodeled master suite of our home. Colin was 34, an arrogant tech entrepreneur who claimed he needed a temporary place to stay so he could save capital for his software startup. I wanted to be supportive. I had already liquidated a substantial portion of my hard-earned retirement portfolio to fund his initial seed round. I wrote him a check for $150,000, believing I was providing a launching pad for my only child. In reality, I was funding the very parasites that would try to bleed me dry. They treated our 4,000-square-foot home like a complimentary luxury hotel where the management could be openly despised. The disrespect was a daily suffocating presence. Brooke would sleep until noon, walk into the kitchen my wife had meticulously cleaned, and leave her expensive takeout containers scattered across the granite countertops. She would openly complain about the brand of coffee Diane purchased, asking why we insisted on drinking cheap garbage when we clearly had the money for imported beans. Colin was worse. He parked his heavily leased luxury sports car diagonally across the driveway, forcing me to park my truck on the street in the snow. Whenever Diane asked them to turn down their music late at night, Colin would roll his eyes and tell his mother to take a sleeping pill. I watched my sweet, gentle wife shrink inside her own home. I watched her tiptoe down her own hallways so she would not disturb Brooke's mid-afternoon naps. You might wonder why a man who spent his life directing massive construction crews allowed this to happen. It was guilt. During Colin's childhood, I was a workaholic. I missed baseball games, birthdays, and anniversaries because I was always on a job site across the state. Colin knew I carried that heavy guilt, and he weaponized it brilliantly. Every time I considered throwing them out, Colin would remind me that a real father supports his son's dreams, subtly implying that I owed him this sacrifice to make up for my past absences. So I swallowed my pride, paid their utility bills, bought their groceries, and allowed the rot to spread through our foundation. The day the structure finally gave way started in a sterile, brightly lit medical clinic. I had a routine appointment with my cardiologist downtown. I am in good shape for 71, but a lifetime of high stress and black coffee had left me with a mild heart arrhythmia that required monitoring. I sat on the cold examination table while the doctor listened to my chest, completely unaware that while I was having my pulse checked, my son was executing a hostile takeover of my life. The doctor told me my blood pressure was slightly elevated. He told me I needed to avoid unnecessary stress, relax, and enjoy my retirement. I thanked him, put my jacket back on, and drove the 45 minutes back to the suburbs, completely ignorant of the ambush waiting for me. That 45-minute window was all Colin needed to strike. When I turned onto our quiet, tree-lined street, I saw Diane standing by the front gate. The sight of her holding that single leather bag in the freezing wind made the blood freeze in my veins. I parked the truck and hurried toward her. She could barely speak through her tears. She pointed toward the porch. Colin was standing on the top step, He was not wearing a coat. He looked completely relaxed, holding a thick stack of manila folders in his right hand. He was smirking. Brooke stood behind him in the doorway, sipping sparkling water, looking at my wife with absolute contempt. I asked Colin what he thought he was doing. I demanded to know why his mother was crying in the cold. Colin walked slowly down the steps. He held out the papers. He told me he was simply exercising his legal rights as the property owner. He looked me dead in the eye and said the house belonged to him now. I told him he was out of his mind. I reminded him that my name was on the deed that I had paid off the mortgage a decade ago. That is when Colin delivered the fatal blow. He reminded me of the paperwork I had signed 6 months ago. At the time, Colin had come to me in a panic, claiming his startup was facing a massive tax liability. He begged me to sign a series of documents that he described as a temporary tax shelter, a way to legally shield my assets while helping him secure a crucial business loan. I had trusted my son. I had signed where the yellow sticky notes told me to sign without hiring my own lawyer to review the massive stack of legal jargon. Colin casually informed me that those documents were not a tax shelter. It was a legally binding quitclaim deed. I had unknowingly signed over the entire legal ownership of my property to a private limited liability company controlled entirely by Colin and Brooke. He stood in my driveway, the driveway I had poured with my own hands, and told me that he was officially evicting us. He said I was an old man who did not understand modern business. He claimed I was holding him back, that this house was wasted on 2 elderly people who just sat around doing nothing. He said he was being generous by giving us 24 hours to pack our personal belongings and vacate the premises. Brooke laughed from the porch, adding that we should probably look into a cheap retirement home. The rage that flared inside me was hot enough to melt steel. Every instinct I had urged me to grab my son by the collar of his expensive shirt and throw him off my property. I wanted to tear the papers from his hands, but my engineering mind took over. Anger is a useless emotion when a building is collapsing. You do not yell at the crumbling concrete. You assess the structural damage, secure the survivors, and prepare the demolition. I looked at Colin. I did not give him the satisfaction of seeing me lose my temper. I did not argue the legality of the documents in the driveway. I turned my back on him. I put my arm around Diane, picked up her suitcase, and walked straight past my son and his vicious wife. Colin yelled after me, warning me that if I damaged any of his property inside, he would have me arrested for vandalism. I ignored him. I walked Diane through the front door, down the hall, and into the guest bedroom, where we had been forced to sleep for 2 years. I closed the heavy solid wood door and locked it. I guided Diane to the edge of the bed and told her to breathe. I promised her with a voice as calm and cold as a winter night that everything was going to be handled. I walked over to the small floor safe hidden in the back of the closet. I spun the dial, opened the heavy steel door, and began cataloging our remaining physical assets. I pulled out our passports, my emergency cash reserves, and the original blueprints of the house. Colin thought he had outsmarted an old man. He thought I would crumble under the weight of his betrayal. He had no idea that he had just declared war on a man who knew exactly how to tear down a foundation until there was nothing left but dust. I stood in the center of the guest bedroom and listened to the heavy footsteps of my son moving across the hardwood floors above me. He was pacing the master suite that I had built for my wife, and he was likely celebrating his perceived victory. I blocked out the sound. In engineering, when a structure is compromised, you do not waste time lamenting the cracks in the drywall. You salvage the load-bearing materials and you evacuate the hazard zone. I turned back to the steel floor safe hidden beneath the carpet in the closet. I had already removed our passports and the original house blueprints, but that was just paper. Wars are not fought with paper alone. I reached deep into the back of the heavy metal box and pulled out a thick, sealed canvas bag. For 30 years, I had quietly skimmed a portion of my annual bonuses and stored them here in pure cash. It was my emergency disaster fund, a habit I developed after seeing too many good men ruined by sudden economic downturns. I broke the seal and quickly counted the bundles of crisp $100 bills. There was exactly $40,000 in untraceable currency. Colin had access to my primary checking accounts, and he knew my pension schedule, but he had no idea this cash existed. This was my leverage. I placed the bundles into a plain leather duffel bag. I added my vintage gold watch Diane grandmother wedding ring and the backup hard drive containing my encrypted financial records. I zipped the bag shut. The physical weight of the bag grounded me. I was no longer a victim trapped in a collapsing house. I was a man with resources preparing a tactical withdrawal. I walked out of the closet and found Diane sitting on the edge of the small guest bed. She was staring blankly at the wall with her hands resting limply in her lap. The shock of our son betrayal had drained the color from her face. She looked at me with eyes that held 4 decades of shattered maternal love. She asked me in a whisper where we were supposed to go. She asked how her own flesh and blood could do this to us. I sat down next to her and took her cold hands in mine. I did not offer her empty platitudes. I did not tell her that Colin would magically come to his senses. I looked her in the eyes and told her that we were leaving the battlefield. I told her that the boy upstairs was no longer our son, but a structural hazard that needed to be isolated. I stood up and pulled 2 medium-sized suitcases from under the bed. I told Diane to pack only the essentials. I told her to leave behind the fancy dresses, the heavy winter coats, and anything that tied her to the memories of this house. We were not packing for a vacation. We were packing for a siege. I watched my wife slowly stand up and move toward the dresser. Every movement she made was heavy with grief. She folded her modest sweaters, her comfortable shoes, and her daily medications. I packed my own bag with the same ruthless efficiency. 3 pairs of trousers, a half-dozen shirts, and my shaving kit. I left behind my expensive suits and my golf clubs. Everything else was just dead weight. Within 20 minutes, our entire lives were condensed into 3 pieces of luggage. I carried the heavy bags to the front door. Diane followed closely behind me with her head bowed. As I reached for the brass doorknob, I heard the arrogant laughter of my daughter-in-law echoing from the kitchen. Brooke was talking loudly on her cell phone, bragging to one of her friends about how she finally had the whole house to herself and how she was already planning to tear out the antique kitchen cabinets. A younger and more foolish man would have marched into that kitchen and demanded respect. I simply unlocked the front door, ushered my wife outside, and pulled the door shut behind us with a quiet click. I did not say goodbye. I did not leave a note. The silence of our departure was louder than any screaming match could ever be. I loaded the bags into the bed of my pickup truck and helped Diane into the passenger seat. I started the engine and pulled out of the driveway. I did not look back in the rearview mirror. Looking back is for people who are unsure of their destination. I drove through our quiet suburban neighborhood, navigating the familiar streets with cold precision. I bypassed the main highway and took the secondary roads, ensuring we were not being followed by Colin or any of his associates. The silence in the truck cabin was heavy and was broken only by the hum of the tires against the asphalt. Diane rested her head against the cool glass of the window, silently weeping as the life she knew faded into the distance. I drove for 40 miles until the manicured lawns of our suburb gave way to the harsh, practical concrete of the industrial district on the edge of the city. I pulled into the parking lot of a sprawling and heavily fortified extended-stay motel. It was not a luxury resort. It was a purely functional building surrounded by tall, chain-link fences and bright security lights. The clientele consisted of traveling construction crews, independent contractors, and people who valued their privacy above all else. I parked the truck near the front office and left Diane resting in the locked vehicle. I walked inside and approached the thick plexiglass window of the reception desk. I did not use a credit card. I pulled a thick stack of $100 bills from my pocket and slid them under the glass. I rented their most secure corner unit on the third floor for 2 full months, paying entirely in cash. The clerk asked no questions and I offered no explanations. I took the magnetic keycard, walked back out to the truck, and drove around to the designated parking space. I carried our bags up the external concrete stairs, unlocked the heavy metal door of our new room, and turned on the lights. The room was small, clean, and completely devoid of any personal history. It had a modest kitchenette, a small dining table, and a sturdy lock on the door. I set the bags down, walked over to the window, and pulled the heavy blackout curtains completely shut. We were officially off the grid. Colin and Brooke thought they had evicted 2 helpless old people onto the streets. They thought we were scrambling for shelter, broken and defeated. They had no idea that I had just successfully removed my most valuable asset from the line of fire. I sat down at the small laminate table, pulled out a yellow legal pad, and uncapped my pen. The tactical retreat was complete, and now it was time to plan the demolition. The morning after our tactical retreat to the industrial motel, I did not waste time mourning the loss of my comfortable life. I woke up at 5 in the morning, made a pot of bitter coffee in the small motel kitchenette, and stood by the window watching the sun rise over the cold concrete of the city. Diane was still sleeping, deeply exhausted by the sheer emotional trauma of the previous afternoon. I did not wake her. I left a short, reassuring note on the laminate nightstand, took my heavy leather duffel bag, and walked quietly down the exterior metal stairs to my truck. I merged onto the highway and drove straight into the towering glass and steel canyons of the downtown financial district. I parked in a subterranean garage beneath a sleek corporate skyscraper and took the private express elevator to the 42nd floor. I was not there to visit a friendly neighborhood family lawyer who specialized in soft mediation, tearful reconciliations, and emotional compromises. I had no interest in negotiating with a parasite. I was there to see a man who specialized in complete, absolute financial annihilation. Gavin Pierce was a forensic litigator. He was a corporate assassin wrapped in a custom-tailored charcoal suit. We had met 2 decades ago when I was the lead structural engineer on a massive commercial development project on the south side of the city. The general contractor on that specific project had been quietly cutting corners, using substandard load-bearing steel and falsifying the daily inspection reports to save money. When I discovered the dangerous structural flaws, I completely refused to sign off on the project. The contractor threatened to ruin my professional reputation and promised to tie me up in endless crippling litigation. That was exactly when the development firm brought in Gavin. I watched Gavin systematically and ruthlessly dismantle that contractor's entire life. Gavin did not just win the lawsuit. He unearthed a decade of the man-hidden tax fraud shell companies and illegal offshore accounts, ensuring the corrupt contractor never worked in the construction industry again and ultimately faced a federal judge. Gavin was clinical, entirely devoid of sentimentality, and operated with a terrifying precision. He was exactly the kind of weapon I needed to aim at my own son. The receptionist led me through a set of heavy frosted glass doors and into a sprawling corner office overlooking the sprawling city skyline. Gavin was standing behind a massive desk carved from solid black marble. He had aged since I last saw him, with sharp lines around his mouth and silver at his temples, but his dark eyes were just as predatory and unyielding as I remembered. He did not offer a warm embrace. He did not ask how I was enjoying my golden years of retirement. He simply gestured to a high-backed leather chair opposite his desk and sat down across from me. I sat down, placing the heavy leather duffel bag by my feet. I reached inside, pulled out the thick manila folder containing the county property records, and placed it squarely in the center of his immaculate desk. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I needed him to initiate a controlled demolition. I explained the situation without a single tremor in my voice. I stripped away all the emotional betrayal, all the heartbreak of a father losing a child, and presented him with only the cold, hard, structural facts of the transaction. I told him that 24 hours ago, my son Colin had successfully evicted me from the home I built claiming absolute legal ownership of the property. I explained the specific documents Colin had presented to me 6 months prior. I told Gavin how my son had come to me sweating and panicked, claiming his new software startup was facing a massive catastrophic tax liability that could result in federal seizures. Colin had begged me to sign a series of dense documents that he enthusiastically described as a temporary legal tax shelter. He swore it was a standard mechanism designed only to temporarily shield my personal assets from his business liability, while simultaneously helping him secure a crucial commercial bridging loan. I admitted to Gavin that I had trusted my flesh and blood. I had signed exactly where the little yellow sticky notes told me to sign, without hiring outside legal counsel to review the massive stack of dense legal jargon. Gavin did not show an ounce of pity. Pity is useless in a war room. He simply nodded, opened the manila folder, put on a pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses, and began to silently scrutinize the documents I had pulled from the municipal records office. The room was absolutely silent for 15 agonizing minutes, save for the crisp, sharp sound of Gavin turning the heavy paper. He examined the specific dates, the authorized signatures, the official notary stamps, and the incredibly dense legal phrasing of the transfer clauses. I watched his eyes track back and forth across the pages, scanning for vulnerabilities the same way I used to scan architectural blueprints for fatal stress points. When he finally finished, he closed the folder, removed his glasses, and placed them deliberately on the top of the desk. He leaned back in his leather chair and folded his hands. He told me that from a purely mechanical standpoint, it was a beautifully executed piece of corporate fraud. He confirmed my worst fears. The paperwork I signed was never a tax shelter. It was an airtight, irrevocable quitclaim deed bundled with a comprehensive financial proxy agreement. Gavin pointed to a dense, highly technical paragraph buried on page 14 of the document. He explained that Colin had not just tricked me into legally signing away the physical property. Colin had woven in a predatory medical clause that legally designated my son as the primary executor and trustee of my entire estate. The document explicitly cited my advanced age and referenced a completely fictitious decline in my cognitive abilities as the primary justification for the transfer of power. Gavin looked at me with a cold, calculating expression. He told me that Colin had effectively erased my legal existence. My son had weaponized my trust and built a legal fortress around his theft. Gavin warned me that breaking this specific type of legally binding contract in a standard civil court would take years of grueling litigation and hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. He said Colin clearly expected me to simply run out of money and give up before we ever saw the inside of a courtroom. I listened to his assessment without flinching. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the marble desk, and asked Gavin exactly what it would take to bypass the civil courts entirely and burn my son fortress straight to the ground. A slow, dangerous smile spread across the forensic litigator face as he picked up his pen. Gavin tapped his heavy silver pen against the solid black marble desk. He asked the single question that had been hovering in the cold air of the office since I sat down. He wanted to know how a man who spent 40 years calculating structural loads and verifying every single rivet on a suspension bridge could blindly sign a stack of unverified legal documents. He leaned forward and told me that the Howard Collins he knew would have demanded a magnifying glass and 3 independent legal reviews before signing a receipt for a cup of coffee. He asked me what critical blind spot my son had exploited to completely bypass my standard operating procedures. I looked out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the corner office. I watched the tiny cars moving through the city streets far below us. I had literally helped build the skyline we were looking at. I told Gavin that the blind spot was not a lack of intelligence, but a profound structural defect in my own conscience. I explained that when Colin was growing up, I was rarely home. I was managing massive commercial developments in 3 different states. I left the house before the sun came up, and I returned long after my son had gone to sleep. I told Gavin about the time I missed my son's 10th birthday because a concrete pour on a high-rise foundation had gone catastrophically wrong, and required my immediate presence for 48 straight hours. I remembered returning home 2 days later to find a stale piece of birthday cake in the refrigerator and a profound, crushing silence in my house. I explained to the forensic litigator that my wife Diane had practically raised our son as a single mother. I provided the money, the private school tuition, the expensive summer camps, but I never provided my actual physical presence. I thought I was building an empire for my family, but I was actually building a massive reservoir of guilt. Colin grew up knowing exactly how heavy that guilt was. He learned to read my regrets the same way I learned to read complex architectural blueprints. He realized early on that if he framed his personal failures as a direct result of my absence, I would immediately open my checkbook to compensate for my lack of parenting. Gavin listened without a single shred of judgment. He simply nodded his head and asked me to describe the exact conversation that took place on the day I signed the fraudulent deed. I took a slow breath and laid out the memory with clinical precision. I told Gavin that Colin had come to the house looking disheveled and frantic. He had paced the hardwood floor of my study, claiming his software startup was weeks away from total bankruptcy due to a massive unforeseen corporate tax liability. When I hesitated and suggested we bring in a certified public accountant to review his financial books, Colin played his absolute masterstroke. He stopped pacing, looked at me with tears in his eyes, and told me that this was the one time he actually needed his father to protect him. He said I had missed his entire childhood building structures for strangers, and now his own company was collapsing because I refused to help him build his foundation. He told me that if I forced him to go through corporate lawyers, the delay would trigger federal audits and destroy his entire life. He looked down at the floor and whispered that he just wanted to know I had his back for once. That was the fatal strike. He weaponized 40 years of my parental regret in a single calculated sentence. I told Gavin that the immense guilt blinded me entirely. I did not see a predatory scam artist standing in my study. I only saw the 10-year-old boy whose birthday I had missed. So I picked up the pen and I signed every single page he put in front of me, believing I was finally being the protective father he always wanted. I signed away the physical roof over my head to buy forgiveness for my past sins. Gavin stopped tapping his pen. He wrote down a single line on his legal pad and told me that guilt is the most expensive emotion a man can harbor. He stated that Colin had executed a psychological con job that was as brilliant as it was repulsive. But Gavin did not dwell on the tragedy of the situation. He looked back down at the property transfer documents and adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. He told me that understanding the psychological manipulation was only the first step. The real problem, he explained, was what my son had actually done with the property after I signed away the deed. Gavin slid a secondary thick folder across the marble desk. He told me that Colin was not acting alone and that my house was now the center of a much larger financial conspiracy. Gavin Pierce did not stop his relentless assault with the forged property transfer documents. He reached into his leather briefcase and slid a second incredibly thick manila folder across the heavy black marble desk. This second folder was noticeably heavier than the first one. Gavin looked at me with cold, calculating eyes and told me that forensic accounting is very much like pulling a single loose thread on a poorly tailored suit. Once you start pulling that thread, the entire fabric unravels rapidly to reveal the ugly and compromised stitching hidden underneath the surface. He explained in a calm and methodical voice that when he first saw the specific name of the limited liability company listed on the fraudulent quitclaim deed, he immediately ran a deep background trace through his expensive proprietary corporate databases. Colin and my daughter-in-law, Brooke, had formally named the holding company Apex Summit Holdings. To an outside observer, it sounded exactly like a standard aggressive technology startup name. It was the kind of name my son would invent to stroke his own massive ego. But Gavin told me that Apex Summit Holdings was absolutely not a technology company, and it certainly was not controlled by my son. Gavin opened the heavy folder and spread out a series of incredibly complex corporate flowcharts across the marble surface. He pointed his silver pen to the very bottom of the page where the name of my son was listed. My son, the supposedly brilliant entrepreneur, who always bragged loudly about his massive seed rounds and exclusive venture capital meetings, was listed as a minor subservient partner with a mere 10% equity stake in the company. Brooke held another 10% stake. Gavin looked directly at me and asked if I was fully prepared to see exactly who held the remaining 80% controlling interest in the house I had painstakingly built with my own hands. Gavin reached into the folder and placed a glossy high-resolution photograph directly in the center of the desk. It was a picture of a broad-shouldered man wearing a sharply tailored suit and shaking hands with the city mayor at a recent charity gala. I recognized the man in the photograph immediately. His name was Gordon Sullivan. He was the father of my daughter-in-law, Brooke. Gordon was widely known as one of the most ruthless and predatory commercial real estate developers in the entire state. He was a man deeply notorious for aggressively buying up distressed residential properties, bulldozing historic family neighborhoods, and erecting massive soulless luxury condominiums in their place. Gordon was a man who literally measured his personal worth in poured concrete and hostile corporate takeovers. Gavin explained that Gordon Sullivan was the absolute majority shareholder and the sole managing director of Apex Summit Holdings. My son had not just stolen my house so he could live in the master bedroom. He had actively and legally traded the deed of my home to his wealthy father-in-law. I sat back in the heavy leather chair and felt a cold, dark knot tighten violently in my stomach. I asked Gavin why Colin would ever willingly surrender the control of a multi-million-dollar property to a man like Gordon Sullivan. My son was incredibly greedy and exceptionally arrogant, but he was also deeply possessive of his assets. Giving up 80% of a stolen physical asset made absolutely zero logical sense unless there was a massive external financial pressure actively forcing his hand. Gavin nodded approvingly at my deduction. He told me that I still possessed a highly analytical engineering mind. He then pulled out a thick stack of bank statements and internal financial audits that his firm had somehow acquired in less than 24 hours. Gavin told me that the software startup my son had been running for the past 2 years was a complete and absolute financial fraud. For 24 entire months, Colin had been aggressively projecting the carefully curated image of a highly successful technology visionary. He drove a heavily leased luxury sports car, he wore incredibly expensive designer clothes, and he constantly talked down to me about his revolutionary software algorithms. But the stark financial documents spread across the marble desk told a completely different and pathetic story. Gavin pointed a steady finger to the heavy red lines bleeding across the corporate balance sheets. The software company had never actually generated a single dollar of legitimate profit. Colin had burned completely through the initial $150,000 I had given him in less than 6 months. He had selfishly spent my hard-earned retirement money on lavish marketing parties, incredibly expensive downtown office spaces, and vastly inflated salaries for himself and his equally incompetent friends. When my money finally ran out, Colin had secretly turned to Gordon Sullivan for a massive private loan to keep his pathetic illusion alive. Gordon had happily given his son-in-law the necessary capital, but being a predatory businessman, he had attached incredibly aggressive interest rates and brutal repayment terms to the hidden loan. Over the last 18 months, Colin had racked up over $2 million in toxic debt directly owed to Gordon Sullivan. Gavin carefully explained that Gordon was definitely not a man who ever forgave financial debts, even for his own family members. When Gordon finally demanded his money, Colin panicked. My son had absolutely zero liquid assets. His technology company was entirely worthless, and his bank accounts were empty. So Colin offered his father-in-law the only tangible asset he could secretly access, which was my house. I sat in the quiet office and listened to the methodical destruction of my son's entire life story. Everything Colin had told me for the past 3 years was a carefully fabricated lie designed only to cover up his catastrophic personal and professional failures. But the depth of the corporate betrayal went even further than covering a bad debt. I looked at the forensic litigator and asked what a billionaire like Gordon Sullivan actually wanted with a single suburban property. Gordon built massive commercial skyscrapers that touched the clouds. A 4,000-square-foot house in the quiet suburbs was nothing more than loose change to a massive developer. Gavin smiled a very cold and highly predatory smile. He told me that Gordon absolutely did not care about the physical house itself. Gordon cared only about the completely unencumbered financial equity trapped inside the walls. Because I had diligently paid off my 30-year mortgage a decade ago, the house was a pure, unblemished financial asset, worth a substantial amount of money. Gavin revealed the final and most devastating layer of the corporate conspiracy. Gordon Sullivan was currently trying to secure a massive $70 million commercial construction loan from an international bank to build a sprawling new shopping complex in the downtown district. But the personal company Gordon owned was currently over-leveraged, and the international bank absolutely required additional collateral to finalize the massive loan. Gordon had intentionally used Apex Summit Holdings to absorb my house, and he was now using the stolen equity of my family home as the final required piece of collateral needed to secure his $70 million bank loan. My home, the place where I had raised my family, was currently serving as a crucial financial linchpin in a massive corporate scheme. The sheer staggering scale of the deception finally settled over the cold, quiet room. My son had not just coldly evicted his elderly parents to secure a free luxury place to live. He had willingly sacrificed us on the altar of his own massive financial failures. He had thrown his own mother and father to a corporate shark simply to save himself from total bankruptcy and personal ruin. Gavin leaned back in his chair and slowly steepled his fingers together. He told me that if we filed a standard civil lawsuit in the county court to reclaim the stolen deed, Gordon Sullivan would simply use his massive, expensive legal team to stall the proceedings for many years. Gordon would easily bury us in endless legal motions and complex appeals until my $40,000 in emergency cash ran out completely, and I was forcefully starved into dropping the case. Gordon had infinitely deeper pockets, and he would happily bleed me dry just to protect his crucial commercial loan collateral. The forensic litigator looked at me closely, waiting to see if the overwhelming financial power of a billionaire developer would break my structural resolve. I looked down at the financial documents detailing the pathetic cowardice of my son and the arrogant greed of Gordon Sullivan. I did not feel an ounce of fear. I felt a cold, absolute clarity wash over my mind. The parameters of the conflict had simply changed. It was no longer a sad domestic dispute over a piece of suburban real estate. It was a high-stakes corporate war. I told Gavin that structural engineers never attack a reinforced concrete wall with a simple hammer. We find the absolute weakest structural point, and we plant the explosive right at the core. Gordon Sullivan had attached his entire $70 million empire to a stolen house. I told Gavin that we were going to turn that house into an absolute liability. We were going to cut the legal foundation out from under the billionaire and let the entire massive structure crash down directly on my son's head. I left the towering glass skyscraper of the financial district and drove back to the industrial outskirts of the city where I had hidden my wife. As I navigated the heavy afternoon traffic, my cell phone began to vibrate violently against the center console of my truck. The screen lit up over and over again, flashing the names of my son and my daughter-in-law. A man driven by blind emotion would have answered those calls immediately. He would have screamed into the receiver demanding justice, threatening lawsuits, and completely revealing his strategic hand. But Gavin Pierce had reminded me of a fundamental truth of warfare. Silence is the most terrifying weapon you can deploy against an arrogant enemy. When you do not react, you completely deprive the parasite of the emotional feedback they desperately crave. You force them to sit alone with their own paranoia. I did not answer the phone. I reached over, pressed the power button, and watched the screen fade to black. For the first time in 34 years, I was completely inaccessible to my son. I was no longer the reliable father who would rush to fix his mistakes. I was a ghost. When I unlocked the heavy metal door of our third-floor motel room, Diane was sitting exactly where I had left her. She had made a small cup of tea, but it sat untouched and cold on the laminate table. I walked over and gently kissed the top of her head. I did not burden her with the terrifying reality of Gordon Sullivan and his $70 million corporate conspiracy. My wife was already carrying the unbearable weight of a broken maternal heart. She did not need to know that we were preparing to engage in a vicious legal war with a billionaire real estate developer. I simply sat down across from her, held her hands, and told her that I had spoken with a very capable associate. I promised her that the situation was being handled with absolute precision, and that all she needed to do was rest and trust me. I unpacked my small shaving kit and placed my heavy leather duffel bag of emergency cash firmly under the bed. I was establishing our new perimeter. The concrete walls of the cheap motel felt safer and stronger than the 4,000-square-foot luxury home my son had stolen. Later that evening, I powered my cell phone back on for exactly 5 minutes to check for any urgent messages from Gavin. I had 32 missed calls from Colin and 14 text messages from Brooke. My son was clearly panicking. His voicemails started out arrogant, demanding to know where I had taken his mother. By the 10th voicemail, his tone had shifted to a desperate pleading, asking me to just call him back so we could negotiate like adults. I deleted every single voicemail without listening to the end. Then I opened the text messages from my daughter-in-law. Brooke did not possess my son's fragile conscience. Her messages were dripping with venom and entitlement. She demanded that I immediately return to the property and hand over the remaining sets of physical house keys and the master codes to the garage doors. She threatened to call the local police and report me for trespassing if I ever set foot on the driveway again. She typed out a long paragraph mocking my silence, claiming that my refusal to respond was just the pathetic cowardice of a beaten old man. I read her vicious words carefully, absorbing every ounce of her arrogance. She firmly believed she was the apex predator in this scenario. She thought her wealthy father had successfully crushed a retired engineer and his quiet wife. She wanted me to feel small. She wanted me to surrender the final physical symbols of my ownership to complete her absolute victory. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, and I did not type a single letter in response. I did not defend my honor, and I did not tell her that the keys she so desperately wanted were about to become the very instruments of her financial destruction. I simply took the physical keys out of my pocket and placed them on the motel table. I took the battery completely out of my cell phone, placing the plastic and lithium pieces next to the keys. I was officially dark. I had severed the final communication lines. Colin and Brooke were now locked inside a stolen house, completely blind to the massive legal explosive that Gavin and I were currently wiring directly to their foundation. I woke up at 3 a.m. The cheap digital clock on the motel nightstand glowed a harsh red in the absolute darkness. Diane was breathing softly beside me, her face lined with the deep exhaustion of betrayal. The 24-hour eviction window my son had so graciously granted me was rapidly closing. Brooke had aggressively demanded the final sets of house keys via text message, but I still legally possessed them until noon. I quietly slipped out of the stiff motel bed, dressed entirely in dark clothing, and picked up my heavy leather bag. I drove through the empty industrial district and navigated back toward the wealthy manicured suburbs. The roads were completely deserted, covered in a thick layer of early morning fog. I was returning to the scene of the crime not to surrender my dignity, but to gather the raw digital materials required for absolute destruction. I parked my truck 3 streets away from my own property to ensure the engine noise would not wake the neighborhood. I walked through the damp morning grass, avoiding the bright pools of light cast by the street lamps. When I finally reached my own driveway, I saw Colin's expensive leased sports car parked carelessly across the concrete exactly where my truck used to sit. The massive 4,000-square-foot house was completely dark and silent. They were fast asleep in the master suite, entirely confident in their stolen empire. I pulled my original brass key from my pocket. I did not use the electronic keypad on the garage door because I knew Colin had connected it to a smart home system that would instantly send a notification directly to his phone. I walked around to the side of the house and manually unlocked the heavy door that led directly into the utility mudroom. I turned the brass handle with the agonizing slowness of a man defusing a live explosive. The door swung open silently. I was standing inside the home I had paid for, but I moved with the cold, calculating precision of a hostile intruder. I did not go upstairs. I did not walk into the custom kitchen or the spacious living room where we used to celebrate holidays. I moved straight toward the heavy solid wood door that led down to the basement. When Colin first moved back in, he had loudly demanded that I convert the entire climate-controlled lower level into a dedicated server room for his software startup. He had spent my retirement money on massive black steel racks and rows of flashing servers, claiming he desperately needed enterprise-level infrastructure to process his complex algorithms. When his company supposedly outgrew the space, he moved his primary operations to an expensive downtown office, but he was far too lazy to uninstall the massive physical hardware. He left the heavy backup drives humming quietly in the dark basement, treating my home as a free climate-controlled digital storage facility. He assumed an old retired structural engineer would never understand how to navigate a complex digital network. That arrogant assumption was his second fatal miscalculation. I walked down the wooden stairs and turned on a small handheld flashlight. The basement was incredibly cool and hummed with the low constant vibration of the server cooling fans. I approached the massive steel rack standing in the center of the concrete floor. Colin was a man who aggressively projected the image of a brilliant technology visionary, but I knew he was fundamentally lazy and incredibly disorganized. The back of the server rack was a chaotic mess of tangled wires and poorly managed cables. An engineer knows that security is an active physical discipline that requires constant methodical maintenance. Colin relied entirely on complex software firewalls to protect his data from external remote attacks, but he completely ignored his physical hardware vulnerabilities. I walked right past his expensive digital firewalls and stood directly in front of the physical machine. I reached into my bag and pulled out a heavy-duty encrypted solid-state drive and a specialized bridging cable I had purchased from a commercial electronics supply store years ago. I plugged my encrypted drive directly into the primary administrative port on the back of the main server chassis. I opened a small portable laptop I had brought with me and connected it to the array. Colin had secured his remote cloud networks with biometric locks and dual-factor authentication, but he had left the physical local backup console entirely unlocked and running on a default administrative profile. It was the exact digital equivalent of installing a massive titanium bank vault door, but leaving the back window completely wide open. I typed in a few basic command prompts that I had learned while managing massive municipal infrastructure networks during my engineering career. The screen flickered a dull green and instantly gave me total unrestricted access to his entire raw data directory. I did not search for specific files. I did not waste time reading individual documents or looking for specific financial spreadsheets. I initiated a complete sector-by-sector clone of the entire server architecture. The progress bar appeared on my small laptop screen, estimating a total transfer time of 45 minutes. That was 45 agonizing minutes of standing in a dark basement, while the ruthless parasites slept directly above my head. I turned off my small flashlight and waited in the absolute dark. The only source of light in the entire room was the slow, methodical blinking of the server transfer lights, casting faint green shadows against the concrete walls. I listened to the quiet, familiar settling of the house foundation. As the man who oversaw the renovations, I knew exactly how weight was distributed across the floor joists. I stood perfectly still, regulating my breathing. Every single minute felt like an hour. I thought about the sheer arrogance of my son sleeping comfortably in the bed my wife had purchased while actively plotting to leave us homeless. That thought extinguished any lingering parental hesitation I might have harbored. At exactly 4:15 in the morning, the silence of the house was broken. I heard the heavy, distinct footsteps of my son walking across the hardwood floor of the master bedroom right above me. He was awake. He walked down the upstairs hallway and stopped directly above the basement stairs. My heart beat heavily against my ribs, but my physical posture remained perfectly steady. I watched the digital progress bar hit 82%. The floorboard directly above my head gave a sharp, familiar squeak. I knew that specific floorboard because I had driven the nails into it myself. If Colin decided to come down to the basement to check the server equipment or grab something from storage, I would be caught red-handed accessing his proprietary corporate data. He could easily call the police and have me arrested for corporate espionage before the sun even came up. The footsteps paused. I heard the faint sound of a water glass being filled from the kitchen sink. The old copper pipes groaned slightly in the walls. He had simply woken up to get a drink of water. I stood frozen in this dark basement, tracking his movements by the sound of his heavy steps. The footsteps turned around and retreated back down the long hallway until the heavy master bedroom door finally clicked shut. He was completely oblivious to the massive security breach happening right under his feet. The digital transfer steadily climbed past 90%. I watched the blinking green lights with the cold anticipation of a predator watching a trap snap shut. The progress bar reached 100%. A small prompt confirmed that 2 entire terabytes of deeply hidden corporate data and financial records had been successfully cloned onto my encrypted drive. I cleanly disconnected the cables from the back of the server. I closed the portable laptop and placed the heavy solid-state drive deep into the protective pocket of my leather bag. I had just extracted the raw, unedited financial truth of Apex Summit Holdings right out from under his nose. I left the basement exactly as I had found it. I carefully wiped the thin layer of dust on the server chassis, where my hand had temporarily rested, ensuring there was absolutely no physical evidence of my presence. I walked back up the wooden stairs and locked the basement door behind me. I stepped back out into the cold, damp morning air through the utility door, making sure the heavy deadbolt engaged silently. I walked the 3 blocks back to my truck, blending effortlessly into the deep shadows of the large oak trees lining the street. The sun was just beginning to break over the eastern horizon, casting a pale gray light across the wealthy neighborhood I was leaving behind forever. I unlocked my truck, started the engine, and drove smoothly away from the property. Later that afternoon, Brooke could have her physical brass keys. Colin could maintain the hollow, empty shell of the 4,000-square-foot house. They thought they had won the war by capturing the physical territory, but I had the complete foundational blueprints of their massive corporate fraud resting securely in the passenger seat of my truck. The raw materials for their destruction were gathered. The silent investigation was officially underway, and the structural analysis of their lies was about to begin. I returned to the industrial motel just as the morning sun began to cast long gray shadows across the cracked pavement of the parking lot. Diane was finally awake, sitting quietly at the small laminate table and staring into a cup of black coffee. I kissed her forehead, told her that the preliminary scouting was complete, and asked for a few hours of absolute uninterrupted silence. I sat down opposite her, opened my laptop, and connected the heavy solid-state drive I had just extracted from our stolen basement. I am a man who spent his entire life studying the complex anatomy of structural failures. When a massive concrete bridge collapses, you do not waste time examining the decorative paint on the guardrails. You dig straight down into the shattered foundation to find the exact microscopic stress fracture that triggered the total destruction. I applied that exact same rigorous engineering discipline to the 2 terabytes of raw, unedited data my son had carelessly left unprotected. I bypassed the superficial folders containing his flashy marketing materials, his hollow corporate mission statements, and his heavily fabricated profit projections. I was looking for the absolute bedrock of his financial architecture. I spent the first 2 hours methodically tracing the complex flow of money from his initial corporate launch to the exact moment he desperately traded our home to his billionaire father-in-law, Gordon Sullivan. I knew that Colin had completely burned through the $150,000 of my retirement money in his first 6 months. I also knew from Gavin that the massive toxic debt to Gordon Sullivan did not begin until Colin was nearly 2 years into his fraudulent venture. There was a massive unaccounted gap of 18 entire months where my son had miraculously continued to fund his lavish lifestyle, pay expensive office leases, and buy custom-tailored suits without generating a single dollar of actual retail profit. I needed to know exactly whose money he was burning during that dark period. I wrote complex search queries utilizing my knowledge of hidden digital directories. I bypassed his standard accounting software and dug deep into the archived raw communication logs. At exactly 9 a.m, I finally hit the bedrock. I found a deeply encrypted subfolder buried inside an obsolete system directory titled Secondary Capital Acquisitions. I broke the basic encryption and opened the primary folder. The screen instantly filled with hundreds of highly official government documents, federal tax identification numbers, and complex institutional wire transfer receipts. My son had not been pitching his useless software to private venture capitalists on the West Coast, like he constantly bragged about at family dinners. He had been actively targeting massive federal innovation grants managed directly by the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. I opened the master application file for a specific federal grant titled Advanced Predictive Algorithms for Commercial Infrastructure Stability. The sheer audacity of the document took my breath away. Colin had aggressively pitched his completely fraudulent software company as a revolutionary engineering firm that could successfully predict catastrophic structural failures in massive commercial high-rises before they ever occurred. He was asking the federal government for a taxpayer-funded grant of $850,000 to further develop his non-existent technology. But I knew exactly how the federal government operated. I had worked on massive municipal government contracts for 4 decades. The federal government absolutely does not wire $850,000 to a 34-year-old arrogant kid with a liberal arts degree and zero practical construction experience. They mandate absolute strict oversight. They require a fully licensed, bonded, and highly experienced veteran structural engineer to sign the official grant application, acting as the primary guarantor and the chief technical director of the proposed project. A terrible cold realization washed over me. My hands hovered perfectly still over the keyboard. I slowly scrolled down to page 42 of the massive federal application. I stared at the glowing laptop screen and felt a deep, sickening twist in my gut that had absolutely nothing to do with money or real estate. Printed clearly under the title of Chief Technical Officer and Primary Project Guarantor was my own name. Howard Collins. Right below my printed name was a high-resolution scanned image of my official state engineering seal. That specific brass seal was not just a piece of metal to me. It was the absolute culmination of 40 years of grueling physical labor studying complex mathematics and standing on freezing steel beams hundreds of feet in the air. That seal meant that when I approved a building, people would not die when the wind blew or the earth shook. It was my honor, my legacy, and my absolute professional soul. Directly below the forged image of my sacred engineering seal was my personal signature. It was a flawless digital forgery. Colin had taken an old birthday card or a forgotten holiday letter, scanned my signature, copied the exact weight of my pen stroke, and pasted it directly onto a legally binding federal document. He had completely prostituted my pristine 40-year professional reputation to steal $850,000 from the United States government. He used my name, my honor, and my lifetime of hard work to illegally finance his leased luxury sports cars, his expensive downtown dinners, and the massive fake empire he used to impress his vicious wife. The betrayal instantly transcended the loss of a suburban home. This was no longer a tragic civil dispute over a piece of residential real estate. My son had committed severe aggravated identity theft and massive federal wire fraud. He had actively defrauded the federal government by illegally leveraging my professional engineering license. If his pathetic software company had ever been randomly audited by a federal inspector, or if his fake technology had somehow been implemented and failed, I would have been the one held entirely responsible. The federal investigators would not have gone after the arrogant kid in the custom suit. They would have come straight for the chief technical officer listed on the forged documents. I would have been completely stripped of my engineering license. My hard-earned pension would have been permanently frozen and seized to pay federal restitution. I would have spent the last fragile years of my life rotting inside a federal prison, entirely disgraced and ruined. My own flesh and blood had deliberately positioned me as the ultimate sacrificial lamb to protect his own pathetic ego. I sat back in the cheap motel chair and stared at the forged signature. I did not feel sorrow. I did not feel the agonizing heartbreak I had felt yesterday when I found my wife crying at the front gate. Every single drop of parental affection I had ever harbored for the boy evaporated into the cold air of the motel room, leaving behind nothing but a profound and absolute terrifying clarity. Colin thought he was a brilliant predator who had successfully outsmarted an obsolete old man. He failed to realize that by forging my name on those specific federal documents, he had accidentally handed me the absolute keys to his total annihilation. The entire strategic landscape shifted instantly. Gavin Pierce had previously warned me that Gordon Sullivan, the billionaire real estate developer, could easily use his massive legal wealth to stall a standard civil lawsuit for years until I simply ran out of emergency cash. Gordon was banking entirely on the fact that civil courts were incredibly slow and largely favored the party with the deepest pockets. But the federal government does not play by civil court rules. The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not care how many expensive corporate lawyers a local real estate developer keeps on his payroll. Wire fraud against the United States government is a massive felony that triggers immediate aggressive federal jurisdiction. I began typing rapidly, extracting the forged documents, the federal wire transfer receipts, and the internal emails where Colin explicitly instructed his friends on how to bypass the federal grant oversight committees. I compiled every single piece of damning evidence into a single heavily encrypted master file. I knew exactly what this specific discovery meant for the massive corporate conspiracy Gordon Sullivan was currently building. Gordon was actively using my stolen house as the primary financial collateral to secure his own massive $70 million international bank loan. But the moment I officially submitted these forged documents to the federal authorities, my house would immediately become the active center of a massive federal fraud investigation. A house tied to an active federal felony cannot be legally used as corporate collateral for anything. The trap was no longer just a legal inconvenience. It was a nuclear bomb. The moment the federal government placed a legal hold on my property, Gordon Sullivan's massive international bank loan would be instantly and permanently frozen. His heavily over-leveraged real estate empire would immediately face a catastrophic financial default. The billionaire who thought he could casually absorb my home to fund his massive commercial skyscrapers was about to have his entire financial foundation blown out from under him. And my son, the arrogant boy who threw his own mother out into the cold, was going to face a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. I closed the laptop screen safely, securing the explosive digital evidence. I looked over at Diane, who was watching me with silent concern. I smiled a very cold and genuine smile. I told her that we were not just going to take our house back. I told her we were going to completely level their entire city. I left the quiet safety of the industrial motel at exactly 11 in the morning. The 24-hour eviction deadline my son had arrogantly dictated was set to expire at precisely noon. I drove my heavy truck back toward the wealthy suburban neighborhood under a thick canopy of gray winter clouds. The weather was bitterly cold, matching the exact temperature of my blood. I was not returning to my home to beg for an extension or to plead for the mercy of my own flesh and blood. I was returning to formally execute the absolute final step of my tactical retreat. The highly encrypted solid-state drive containing the undeniable proof of my son committing massive federal wire fraud was resting securely in the locked glove compartment of my truck. That small square of metal and silicon was the definitive detonator that would completely level their stolen empire. I pulled onto my familiar street and parked my truck neatly by the curb, directly in front of the massive oak tree I had personally planted over 30 years ago. The sprawling 4,000-square-foot house stood tall and imposing at the end of the long concrete driveway, but it no longer looked like a home to me. It looked exactly like a massive, elaborate concrete trap just waiting for the final mechanism to be sprung. I did not have to wait long in the freezing air. At exactly 10 minutes to noon, a shiny black and white municipal police cruiser turned the corner and slowly rolled to a complete stop directly behind my parked truck. A single second later, a pristine white luxury SUV pulled aggressively into the driveway, blocking my truck from the front. My daughter-in-law Brooke stepped out of the driver's side door, wearing oversized designer sunglasses and carrying an incredibly expensive imported leather handbag. She had completely bypassed the standard legal eviction process, which usually requires months of formal court hearings and tedious paperwork. Instead, she had leveraged her wealthy father's deep political connections within the city to secure a police escort for a simple property handover. She wanted an audience for my defeat. She wanted the absolute public humiliation of watching an armed law enforcement officer force her elderly father-in-law off his own land in broad daylight. The uniformed police officer stepped out of his cruiser and nervously adjusted his heavy black utility belt. He looked very young and visibly uncomfortable with the entire domestic situation. Brooke immediately walked over to him, pointing a perfectly manicured finger aggressively in my direction. She spoke loudly enough for the neighbors across the street to hear, claiming that I was a highly hostile and unpredictable former tenant who was stubbornly refusing to vacate her private property. She played the role of the innocent, frightened property owner with a sickening, absolute perfection. The young officer walked slowly up the concrete driveway toward me, keeping a very cautious, professional distance. He tipped his hat respectfully and asked for my full legal name. I gave it to him in a calm, cold, and entirely steady voice. He cleared his throat and formally informed me that the legal property owners had requested my immediate and permanent departure from the premises. He placed his hand near his radio and asked if I was planning to cause any trouble today. I looked the young officer directly in the eye and told him I had absolutely no intention of causing a disturbance. I told him I had already packed all of my personal belongings and was simply waiting on the curb to officially hand over the physical keys. Brooke marched loudly up the driveway, stopping right behind the protective shoulder of the police officer. She crossed her arms tightly over her expensive coat and smiled a vicious, highly triumphant smile. She told the officer to make absolutely sure I handed over every single brass key, the electronic garage door clickers, and the complex master passcodes for the central home security system. She looked me up and down with absolute unfiltered disgust and asked loudly where my weeping, pathetic wife was hiding. She maliciously mocked Diane, saying she sincerely hoped the cheap roach-infested motel we were forced to stay in did not smell too badly of mildew and failure. She told me that I was a stubborn, obsolete old man who finally got exactly what he deserved for trying to hold back the brilliant career of his only son. A younger man would have instantly lost his temper. A man driven by a fragile ego would have yelled at her, called her horrific names, and desperately tried to explain the complex financial history of the house to the highly confused police officer. I did absolutely none of those things. I stood perfectly still on the freezing concrete driveway and looked at the arrogant woman standing in front of me. I did not see a victorious daughter-in-law claiming her rightful prize. I saw a deeply foolish woman standing directly on top of a massive federal landmine, completely unaware that the countdown timer had already reached 0. She genuinely thought she was humiliating me by bringing an armed police officer to force me off the property. She completely failed to realize that having an official law enforcement officer officially document my peaceful and compliant departure was the absolute best thing she could have possibly done for my impending legal strategy. It permanently proved a complete lack of physical hostility on my part, and firmly established their absolute legal possession of the stolen corporate asset, right before the massive federal indictments dropped. Her overwhelming arrogance had just handed me an airtight alibi. I reached very slowly into the deep right pocket of my heavy winter coat. The young officer tensed slightly, keeping his eyes locked entirely on my hands. I pulled out a heavy steel ring holding the 3 original brass house keys and the 2 black plastic garage clickers. I did not hand them to Brooke. I completely ignored her demanding outstretched hand and handed the cold metal keys directly to the police officer. I asked the officer in a clear, authoritative voice to officially note in his daily police report that I had surrendered all physical access items and was vacating the property entirely of my own free will without requiring any physical force. The officer nodded rapidly, taking the keys and visibly relaxing his tense posture. Brooke immediately snatched the keys right out of the officer's hand with a loud, arrogant scoff. She told me to get off her property immediately and to never show my old face in her wealthy neighborhood again. I turned my back on her without saying a single angry word. I walked back to my truck, opened the heavy steel door, and climbed into the cold driver's seat. I rolled down the window just enough to deliver my final structural assessment of her situation. I looked past the highly confused police officer directly into the cold, dead eyes of my daughter-in-law. I told her that she should enjoy the beautiful house while she could, because she was going to find out very soon that the entire foundation was completely rotten. I rolled the window up, started the heavy engine, and drove smoothly away, leaving her standing proudly on a collapsing empire. 2 weeks after the young police officer escorted me off my own driveway, the stolen empire reached its absolute peak of unearned arrogance. Gavin Pierce and I arrived at the property just after 8 in the evening. We did not arrive in my battered work truck. We arrived in the back of Gavin's sleek black corporate town car, completely blending in with the massive fleet of luxury vehicles that were currently choking the quiet suburban street. Colin and Brooke were throwing a massive catered housewarming party. They were not celebrating a new home. They were celebrating their perceived total victory over a retired engineer and his grieving wife. I stepped out of the town car wearing a dark tailored suit I had purchased entirely in cash. I looked up at the 4,000-square-foot house I had built with my own hands. The entire property was completely illuminated by expensive temporary landscaping lights. A team of hired valet drivers in crisp white shirts were aggressively jogging up and down the driveway, parking imported sports cars for the wealthy elite of the city. We did not knock on the front door. A party of this massive scale has absolutely no perimeter security. The heavy oak front door was propped completely wide open, allowing the loud pulsing music and the warm air to spill out into the freezing winter night. Gavin and I walked straight up the concrete pathway and stepped directly into the massive foyer. The sheer audacity of the event was physically staggering. Brooke had hired an incredibly expensive private catering company. Waiters in pristine black uniforms were circulating through the crowded rooms carrying silver trays loaded with imported champagne and delicate appetizers. The house was packed with over 150 guests. These were not friends or close family members. These were elite corporate investors, private venture capitalists, and high-ranking municipal politicians. This was a calculated theater production, designed entirely to project massive financial stability. I stood quietly near the heavy stone fireplace in the main living room, completely unnoticed by the arrogant crowd. I watched my son holding court near the massive bay windows I had personally installed 20 years ago. Colin was wearing a ridiculously expensive velvet tuxedo jacket, holding a crystal glass of champagne and laughing loudly. He was aggressively playing the role of the brilliant young technology visionary. He was telling a circle of wealthy investors about his revolutionary software algorithms, completely ignoring the absolute fact that his entire operation was a catastrophic financial failure built entirely on forged federal documents. He looked so incredibly confident standing on a floor that did not belong to him. Brooke was operating on the opposite side of the massive room, entirely in her element. She was wearing a stunning designer evening gown and aggressively dragging a group of wealthy corporate wives through the main hallway. I listened as she loudly pointed out the beautiful antique oak trim around the door frames, claiming she was absolutely exhausted from dealing with the pathetic, obsolete tastes of the previous owners. She promised her wealthy friends that she was going to bring in a massive demolition crew on Monday morning to tear out the entire kitchen and replace it with imported Italian marble. She was actively bragging about destroying my life work while drinking expensive champagne paid for by the stolen equity of my home. The level of supreme entitlement radiating from her was absolutely toxic. But Gavin Pierce gently touched my shoulder and directed my attention away from the foolish children. He pointed toward the large formal dining room where the true apex predator of the evening was currently holding his audience. Gordon Sullivan, the billionaire commercial real estate developer, was standing at the head of my long mahogany dining table. He was a physically massive man who commanded the absolute attention of everyone in his immediate vicinity. He was surrounded by 4 men wearing conservative gray suits. Gavin leaned in and quietly informed me that those 4 men were the primary regional directors for the massive international bank Gordon was currently lobbying. Gordon was actively using my housewarming party as a strategic corporate presentation. I moved slightly closer, blending into the shadows of the hallway, so I could hear the exact words of the man who had orchestrated the theft of my property. Gordon had a booming, arrogant voice that carried easily over the loud party music. He poured an incredibly expensive glass of scotch for the lead banker and proudly threw his arms wide open, gesturing to the massive house around him. He told the international bankers that this specific property was the absolute perfect example of his brilliant corporate strategy. Gordon loudly bragged that his holding company, Apex Summit Holdings, had just acquired this pristine, heavily appraised piece of suburban real estate for absolutely pennies on the dollar. He completely omitted the fact that he had aggressively exploited his own son-in-law to steal it from an elderly couple. He looked the lead banker directly in the eyes and stated that the massive unencumbered equity trapped inside these walls was exactly the kind of solid, reliable collateral he was bringing to their $70 million commercial construction loan. He promised the bankers that his financial foundation was completely bulletproof and that they had absolutely nothing to worry about. He laughed a deep, booming laugh and drank his scotch, entirely confident that he had successfully manipulated the entire financial system to his absolute advantage. I stood in the shadows of my own hallway and listened to the billionaire build his massive house of cards directly on top of my stolen foundation. He was promising international bankers millions of dollars in secure equity while standing inside a house that was legally tied to a massive federal wire fraud investigation. He had absolutely no idea that the quiet, retired structural engineer standing just 20 feet away from him was holding the definitive digital detonator in his pocket. The arrogance in the room was so thick, it was almost suffocating. They were all drinking, celebrating, and aggressively planning their wealthy futures, completely blind to the fact that their entire empire was already dead. I looked at Gavin Pierce. The ruthless forensic litigator slowly reached inside the breast pocket of his charcoal suit and pulled out the thick, folded stack of federal indictments. The time for silent observation was officially over. Gavin Pierce held the thick stack of folded federal indictments in his right hand and gave me a single brief nod. I stepped out of the dark shadows of the hallway and moved directly into the bright, warm light of the main living room. I did not barge into the space like an angry victim seeking revenge. I walked with the slow, measured, heavy steps of a structural engineer inspecting a building that was completely scheduled for demolition. Gavin walked exactly half a step behind me and slightly to my right. He radiated the terrifying calm of a man who held the absolute power to destroy lives with a simple stroke of his pen. We moved through the crowded room, and the physical atmosphere began to change almost immediately. The expensive catering staff were the very first to notice the shift in the room. A young waiter carrying a silver tray of tall champagne flutes stopped walking and pressed his back tightly against the wall to let us pass. He recognized instantly that we did not belong to the wealthy, arrogant crowd laughing and drinking all around us. We were a completely foreign element entering a closed ecosystem. As I walked deeper into the massive room, the loud conversations began to falter and die out. The elite corporate guests naturally parted ways to clear a wide path for us. They did not know who I was, but the sheer gravity of my silent approach caused a ripple of deep unease to spread across the polished hardwood floor. The loud pulsing party music continued to play through the expensive ceiling speakers, but the human noise in the room rapidly evaporated. The temperature in the massive space seemed to drop 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. Brooke was the very first person to actively recognize me. She was standing near the custom kitchen island, holding a crystal glass and laughing loudly with 3 women wearing incredibly expensive jewelry. She turned her head, and her arrogant, triumphant smile vanished instantly. Her face flushed red with sudden, unfiltered rage. She completely forgot her carefully curated high society persona. She slammed her crystal glass down onto the granite countertop so hard that the fragile stem almost shattered under the impact. She aggressively marched across the room toward me with her expensive designer heels clicking sharply against the floor. She pointed her finger directly at my chest and began to raise her voice, demanding to know how I had bypassed the valet security and how I dared to show my face in her home again. She ordered me to leave immediately before she called the local police to have me arrested and dragged out in handcuffs for criminal trespassing. I did not stop walking. I did not even turn my head to look at her. I simply maintained my steady forward momentum. Gavin Pierce smoothly accelerated his pace and stepped directly into her path. He did not touch her, but his physical presence was like hitting a solid brick wall. He looked down at my furious daughter-in-law with dark eyes completely devoid of any human warmth. He spoke to her in a voice that was perfectly calm and incredibly quiet, but it carried a razor-sharp legal authority that cut right through her arrogant bluster. He advised her to remain absolutely silent. He informed her that anything she said in front of these wealthy witnesses would be formally entered into the federal record as evidence of her ongoing criminal complicity. Brooke froze completely in her tracks. The venom drained out of her face and was rapidly replaced by a sudden, terrible confusion. Gavin did not wait for her to recover from the shock. He stepped neatly around her frozen form and continued walking right beside me. The sudden commotion had finally caught the attention of my son. Colin was standing near the large bay windows, surrounded by the private venture capitalists he had been aggressively lying to all evening. He saw his wife standing completely paralyzed in the middle of the room, and he saw me walking steadily toward the formal dining room. Colin puffed out his chest and tried desperately to project the image of a powerful executive handling a minor domestic disturbance. He excused himself from the wealthy investors and walked quickly to intercept me. He stood directly in my path, actively blocking the wide hallway. He tried to speak with a deep, authoritative voice, telling me that I was completely out of line and that my pathetic emotional stunt was ruining his highly important corporate event. He demanded that I turn around and walk out the front door before he completely humiliated me in front of the entire city elite. I stopped walking. I stood less than 2 feet away from the boy I had raised and provided for his entire life. He was wearing his ridiculously expensive velvet tuxedo and smelling heavily of imported scotch. I looked directly into his eyes. I did not see a powerful technology visionary or a successful entrepreneur. I saw a terrified little boy desperately trying to wear a corporate suit that was vastly too large for him. I did not yell at him. I did not tell him that I already knew about his massive federal wire fraud or the forged engineering seals hiding on his basement servers. I simply stared at him with absolute and total indifference. The silence stretched out between us, heavy and suffocating. Colin tried to maintain his arrogant, angry glare, but his false confidence rapidly began to crumble under the immense weight of my unblinking gaze. He shifted his weight nervously from side to side. The wealthy investors he had been bragging to moments ago were now watching the entire silent exchange with deep corporate suspicion. After 10 agonizing seconds, I stepped forward, forcing Colin to either physically assault me or step aside. His ingrained cowardice won out perfectly, exactly as I knew it would. He took a quick, stumbling step backward, physically yielding the ground to me. I walked right past him without uttering a single word or giving him a second glance. I left him standing in the middle of his lavish party, completely emasculated and powerless in front of the very people he desperately needed to impress. I did not care about Brooke, and I no longer cared about Colin. They were just the minor symptoms of a much larger disease. I walked straight up to the wide arched entrance of the formal dining room. Gordon Sullivan was still standing at the head of my mahogany table, surrounded by the 4 international bankers. He had stopped talking mid-sentence. The massive billionaire looked up from his expensive scotch, and his arrogant smile slowly faded completely as he saw the grim retired engineer and the ruthless forensic litigator standing side by side in his doorway. The trap was fully primed, and the absolute silence in the entire house was deafening. Gordon Sullivan looked at Gavin Pierce and me with a mixture of profound annoyance and calculated superiority. He set his expensive crystal glass of scotch down on the mahogany table with a heavy thud. He looked at the 4 international bankers and offered them a smooth, practiced apology. He told them that occasionally minor domestic disputes spilled over into the corporate world, and he promised to have his private security handle the completely unauthorized intrusion immediately. He turned his massive frame toward us and told me that I had made a catastrophic mistake by interrupting a highly private corporate negotiation. He warned me in a deep, rumbling voice that he was going to bleed my modest pension entirely dry in civil court for this specific public stunt. He laughed a booming, arrogant laugh and told the wealthy crowd that obsolete old men simply did not understand how real business was conducted in the modern world. Gavin Pierce did not even blink at the empty threats. He stepped right up to the head of the mahogany table, completely invading Gordon's personal space. Gavin did not raise his voice, but he spoke with a crisp, piercing clarity that carried perfectly to every single person in the massive dining room and out into the crowded hallway. He introduced himself formally to the 4 international bankers. He gave them his full legal name and the name of his ruthless forensic litigation firm. The lead banker, a tall man with silver hair, immediately recognized the name of the firm. I saw the banker posture stiffen instantly as the color began to drain from his face. Gavin turned his attention directly to Gordon Sullivan. He held up the thick, folded stack of legal documents for the entire room to see. He informed the billionaire developer that he was not there to negotiate a civil dispute, and he was absolutely not there to discuss a pathetic family disagreement. Gavin slapped the heavy stack of papers directly onto the polished mahogany table right next to Gordon's glass of scotch. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the completely silent room. Gavin announced that he was officially serving Gordon Sullivan and Apex Summit Holdings with a formal notice of lispendence. He turned back to the 4 international bankers and explained exactly what that specific legal term meant for their massive $70 million commercial loan. He told them that a lispendence is a formal legal notice recorded directly in the county property registry, indicating that a massive lawsuit is currently pending concerning the absolute legal title of the property. He looked the lead banker right in the eyes and stated clearly that the massive unencumbered equity Gordon had just aggressively pitched to them was entirely frozen. The house was now legally locked by the county clerk. It could not be sold, it could not be transferred, and it absolutely could not be used as corporate collateral for any commercial banking loans under any circumstances. Gordon's face flushed a deep, violent red. The thick veins in his neck bulged against his expensive silk tie. He slammed his heavy fist onto the dining table, violently rattling the expensive silverware and spilling his scotch across the polished wood. He loudly declared to the panicked room that the Lispendens was nothing but a pathetic, frivolous stall tactic filed by a bitter, angry old man. He assured the bankers that his massive team of aggressive corporate lawyers would have the notice completely dissolved by a local county judge before noon on Monday. He pointed a thick finger at my chest and told the silent room that I was completely out of money and that I had absolutely zero legal leverage to sustain a prolonged civil war against his massive real estate empire. He demanded that we leave his property immediately before he destroyed my entire life. Gavin Pierce smiled his terrifying, cold, predatory smile. He calmly reached into his tailored charcoal suit jacket and pulled out a second, smaller folder. He told Gordon that he was entirely correct about the speed of local civil courts and the overwhelming power of corporate wealth in a standard property dispute. But Gavin clarified in a voice as sharp as broken glass that we were absolutely not relying on a local civil judge to settle a simple family property dispute. Gavin slid the second folder deliberately across the mahogany table. He announced to the completely silent room that the secondary document was a certified copy of a formal criminal report filed directly with the Federal Bureau of Investigation exactly 4 hours ago. Gavin pointed his heavy silver pen directly at my son, who was cowering in the hallway right behind us. Gavin informed the billionaire and the 4 international bankers that the managing partner of Apex Summit Holdings had deliberately forged the official state engineering seal and the legal signature of a licensed structural engineer. He spoke loud enough for every single wealthy investor in the house to hear the exact details of the crime. Gavin detailed exactly how Colin had utilized those forged documents to actively submit completely fraudulent applications for massive federal innovation grants from the United States government. Gavin stated clearly, without any room for doubt, that my son had committed multiple counts of aggravated identity theft and massive federal wire fraud. He explained that Colin had completely fabricated a fake engineering technology firm claiming to possess advanced predictive algorithms for commercial infrastructure stability just to steal $850,000 taxpayer dollars. Gavin made sure the international bankers understood that Gordon-own's son-in-law had committed a massive felony that carried a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. Gordon Sullivan looked completely stunned. The furious red color drained entirely out of his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old. He looked frantically at Colin, who was trembling uncontrollably in his expensive velvet tuxedo, completely unable to speak a single word of defense to save himself. Gavin pressed the absolute final nail into the massive corporate coffin. He turned his attention back to the lead international banker. Gavin explained that because the federal wire fraud was actively committed using the local digital computer servers physically located in the basement of this specific property, the entire 4,000-square-foot house was no longer just a piece of disputed residential real estate. The house was now officially classified by the federal government as an active crime scene and primary physical evidence in a massive federal felony investigation. Gavin warned the bankers with absolute chilling authority that any financial institution that knowingly accepted an active federal crime scene as corporate collateral would be immediately subjected to a massive aggressive audit by the United States government. He told them that their entire international bank would be legally entangled in a massive federal racketeering investigation, and that they could personally face severe criminal charges and federal prison time for aiding and abetting corporate fraud. Brooke was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, watching her wealthy father face total financial ruin. The incredibly expensive designer evening gown she was wearing suddenly looked ridiculous against the backdrop of an active crime scene. She covered her mouth with her trembling hands, completely unable to process the sheer magnitude of the disaster. The father she had always believed was absolutely invincible was currently suffocating under the weight of a single manila folder. The silence in the dining room and the surrounding hallway was absolute and completely suffocating. The 4 bankers looked down at the forged federal documents resting on the mahogany table. They looked at Gordon Sullivan, who was sweating profusely, his massive chest heaving as he completely failed to form a coherent sentence to defend his shattered empire. They looked at the terrified son in the hallway, who had just brought the entire weight of the federal government down upon their heads. The lead banker did not hesitate for a single second. He slowly reached out and picked up his expensive leather briefcase. He did not say a single word of farewell or apology to Gordon. He simply buttoned his tailored suit jacket and walked deliberately out of the dining room. I watched the lead banker walk away, and I felt the deep, profound satisfaction of a master structural engineer watching a perfectly executed, controlled demolition. I did not need to plant physical explosives to destroy Gordon Sullivan. I simply found the absolute weakest stress fracture in his massive corporate foundation, which was his own boundless greed and his blind trust in my incompetent son, and I applied the exact precise amount of legal pressure required to trigger a total catastrophic collapse. The house was no longer a luxury asset. It was a concrete anchor tied directly to Gordon's neck. The other three bankers immediately followed his exact lead. They marched right past Gordon, right past my trembling son, and headed straight for the front door to escape the massive radioactive crater that was once a highly lucrative $70 million corporate deal. Every single wealthy investor, private venture capitalist, and local politician in the house watched the bankers flee. The absolute panic spread through the room like wildfire. Within seconds, the elite crowd began to surge toward the exits, desperate to distance themselves from a massive federal fraud investigation. Colin's knees completely buckled under the immense pressure. He collapsed against the antique oak trim of the hallway, sliding down the wall and sitting on the hardwood floor. He buried his face in his hands as the wealthy elite of the city actively stepped over him to rush out the front door. He was entirely broken, stripped of his false genius, and exposed as a pathetic federal criminal. Gavin Pierce looked at Gordon Sullivan, who was now standing completely alone in his empty dining room. Gavin told the billionaire that his entire corporate empire was now legally tied to a massive federal felony. He casually advised Gordon to hire the best criminal defense attorney he could possibly find because the federal government was going to tear his entire life apart, looking for their stolen money. We stood in the center of the collapsing empire and watched the total, absolute destruction of their unearned arrogance unfold exactly as planned. The front door of my home rapidly became a desperate funnel for the fleeing elite of the city. These were highly influential people who survived entirely on their pristine reputations and their careful corporate distance from any real consequences. Being photographed or even recognized at a lavish housewarming party that had just been actively designated as the center of a massive federal crime scene was absolute corporate suicide. The physical chaos in the massive living room was immediate and staggering. The expensive hired catering staff completely abandoned their professional posts. Waiters dropped their heavy silver trays directly onto the imported granite countertops, causing fragile crystal champagne flutes to shatter and spill expensive vintage wine across the pristine white carpets. The hired valet drivers standing out in the freezing cold driveway were suddenly and completely overwhelmed by the massive, aggressive surge of angry, wealthy guests pouring out of the front door and screaming for their luxury vehicles immediately. I stood perfectly still near the heavy stone fireplace with the forensic litigator Gavin Pierce standing silently by my side. We watched the absolute cowards abandon the sinking ship. They did not simply leave the party, they fled in absolute, uncoordinated terror. Women wearing incredibly expensive designer evening gowns actively hiked up their heavy silk skirts and sprinted down the long concrete driveway in the freezing winter air, completely abandoning their coats in the rush to escape. Private venture capitalists and local municipal politicians who had been laughing loudly and drinking my son's expensive scotch just 5 minutes ago were now aggressively shoving each other out of the way to reach the safety of the dark street. Some of the guests were already speaking frantically into their cell phones, ordering their private assistants to immediately wipe their digital calendars and delete any email correspondence connecting them to my son or his fraudulent software startup. The loud, pulsing electronic party music continued to play from the hidden premium ceiling speakers, creating a surreal and deeply pathetic atmospheric soundtrack to the absolute real-time destruction of their unearned empire. Gordon Sullivan was a massive, intimidating man who had spent his entire adult life aggressively bullying smaller contractors and local politicians with his overwhelming financial wealth. But massive corporate wealth is a completely useless illusion when the federal government suddenly freezes your foundational assets. Gordon pulled a heavy gold smartphone from his tailored suit pocket, and his thick fingers were visibly trembling with a raw, terrifying panic. He completely bypassed his local legal team and called his primary financial fixers directly on a secure line. I stood in the quiet shadows of the hallway and listened to his booming, arrogant voice completely crack and break under the immense sudden pressure. He was desperately screaming into the receiver, demanding that his highly paid accountants immediately sever all legal and financial ties between his primary commercial holding company and the toxic Apex Summit at LLC. But the brilliant forensic litigator standing next to me had built a completely flawless and inescapable legal trap. Gavin leaned over and quietly informed me that corporate severing takes many days of complex legal filings, and the federal indictments we just delivered were already officially stamped, verified, and permanently uploaded into the National Department of Justice Registry. Gordon was legally and permanently welded to the massive wire fraud my son had committed. While Gordon was still screaming useless orders into his phone, his encrypted email notifications began to chime in rapid, relentless succession. The 4 international bankers who had just walked out of my formal dining room were incredibly efficient and entirely ruthless. They had immediately contacted their global risk assessment departments from the back of their private cars. Gordon stared down at his glowing screen as the formal digital notices of default began to roll in one after another. His massive $70 million commercial construction loan was instantly legally revoked due to a catastrophic breach of collateral integrity. The corporate dominoes were falling far faster than the human mind could possibly process. Because Gordon had aggressively cross-collateralized his existing real estate portfolio to secure the new loan, the sudden massive default triggered an immediate chain reaction across all of his active corporate accounts. Without that massive influx of international cash, Gordon over-leveraged development company was instantly, completely bankrupt. He dropped his heavy gold phone directly onto the mahogany dining table. The expensive glass screen shattered violently against the polished wood. The billionaire real estate developer grabbed his chest and slumped heavily into one of the dining chairs, struggling to pull air into his lungs, as he fully realized he had just lost a 30-year corporate empire simply because he was far too greedy to use his own money as collateral. My daughter-in-law, Brooke, finally moved away from the safety of the custom kitchen doorway. The arrogant, triumphant woman who had brought an armed municipal police officer to publicly humiliate me in my own driveway just 2 weeks ago was completely gone. Her carefully curated high society persona had instantly evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a cold, desperate parasite searching for a new host to drain. She walked very slowly into the center of the devastated living room, stepping carefully over the discarded broken champagne flutes and the abandoned designer winter coats. She looked into the formal dining room at her father, who was leaning heavily over the table, gasping for air and clutching his chest in the grip of a massive panic attack. She did not rush into the room to comfort him. She did not call for an ambulance or even offer him a simple glass of water. Brooke survived entirely by attaching herself to the absolute strongest available financial entity, and right now her wealthy father was a bleeding, dying corporate corpse. She turned her cold, calculating eyes away from the dining room and looked directly at my son. Colin was still sitting on the hardwood floor in the main hallway, with his face completely buried in his trembling hands. Brooke marched aggressively over to him, and her voice was entirely stripped of all its previous manufactured sweetness. She looked down at the pathetic weeping boy, wearing the ridiculously expensive velvet tuxedo, and she delivered her own ruthless, unfeeling verdict. She spoke loudly enough for the echo to bounce off the high vaulted ceilings telling Colin that she would never spend a single day of her beautiful life visiting a convicted felon in a federal penitentiary. She told him with absolute venom that she was personally contacting the most aggressive divorce attorney in the city the very next morning to completely dissolve their brief marriage and legally insulate herself from any of his impending criminal restitution charges. She pulled the massive custom diamond engagement ring off her left finger and threw it aggressively onto the floor right next to my son. The heavy, expensive ring bounced across the polished hardwood and rolled away, disappearing completely into the dark shadows under an antique console table. She did not shed a single emotional tear for the sudden destruction of her marriage or the downfall of her family. She simply turned her back on her weeping husband, turned her back on her ruined, gasping father, and walked straight out the front door into the freezing winter night, leaving them both entirely alone to drown in the massive wreckage they had created. The massive 4,000-square-foot house was finally completely empty, except for the four of us. The expensive catering staff had vanished into the night. The wealthy, arrogant guests were entirely gone. Only the desperate victims of the collapse and the quiet architects of the demolition remained inside the walls. I walked very slowly across the living room floor and stood directly over my son. Colin heard my footsteps and slowly lifted his face from his hands. His eyes were red-swollen, and he looked completely, entirely shattered. He looked up at me with the desperate, pleading eyes of a terrified young child who had just broken a window and was waiting for his father to fix the problem. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer a pathetic apology, or to beg me to call the federal authorities and desperately claim that the forged engineering seals were just a massive, simple misunderstanding. I did not let him utter a single useless word. I looked down at the boy who had happily and willingly sacrificed his own elderly mother and father to the cold streets, just to save his own incredibly fragile ego. I told him in a voice devoid of any parental warmth that structural engineering requires a relentless and absolute commitment to reality. I told him that when a foundation is completely structurally rotten, you cannot save the massive building with a fresh coat of paint or a desperate, tearful apology. You simply have to clear the area and let the building fall. I told him that the federal government was going to tear his entire fraudulent life down to the absolute bare dirt, and that I was not going to lift a single protective finger to stop them from burying him under the rubble. I turned my back on my son forever and walked steadily toward the open front door. Gavin Pierce fell into perfect step right beside me, leaving the bankrupt billionaire and the terrified criminal to sit entirely alone in the silent ruins of their stolen house. We walked out into the cold, clean winter air. The massive concrete driveway was completely empty. The arrogant luxury sports cars and the loud pulsing music were gone. We climbed into the quiet warmth of the sleek black town car, and the professional driver slowly pulled away from the curb. I looked back through the tinted window at the brightly lit house one final time. It was still standing physically, but I knew with absolute scientific certainty that the entire parasite empire inside those walls had been completely and permanently reduced to ashes. The town car carried me away from the massive property, but the explosive shockwave of my departure detonated almost immediately inside the silent walls of the stolen house. According to the highly detailed police reports filed later that same night, the absolute destruction of their unholy alliance took less than 20 minutes. Gordon Sullivan was a man who solved his corporate problems with aggressive intimidation and overwhelming financial force. But with his bank accounts legally frozen and his massive $70 million commercial loans instantly revoked, he was completely stripped of his civilized corporate disguise. He reverted entirely to a cornered, vicious animal. The ruined billionaire developer stood up from the mahogany dining table and directed every single ounce of his terrifying rage directly at the pathetic boy sitting on the hardwood floor. Gordon did not see a son-in-law anymore. He saw the arrogant, foolish anchor that was currently dragging his entire 30-year empire down into a federal prison cell. Gordon marched into the main hallway, reached down with his massive hands, and grabbed Colin directly by the lapels of his incredibly expensive velvet tuxedo. Gordon dragged my son physically across the polished hardwood floors, the exact same floors my wife had meticulously cleaned for 2 entire years. Colin screamed and begged for mercy, desperately trying to explain that the forged federal engineering grants were just a temporary desperate measure to secure initial seed capital. He pleaded with the billionaire, claiming they could still pool their legal resources and fight the federal indictments together. His pathetic weeping excuses only fueled the absolute violent rage of the ruined real estate developer. Gordon dragged the crying boy through the massive stone foyer and threw him violently out the open front door. Colin stumbled heavily down the front steps, tearing the delicate fabric of his velvet jacket and scraping his bare hands on the freezing concrete driveway. Gordon stood in the massive doorway, breathing heavily, with his face completely purple with rage. He banished Colin from the property permanently. He roared into the quiet winter night that if Colin ever stepped foot near his daughter or his corporate offices again, he would not bother calling the police to handle the trespassing. Gordon violently slammed the heavy oak door shut, throwing the heavy brass deadbolt and locking my son outside in the freezing cold. Colin was completely abandoned, standing shivering on the exact same driveway where he had arrogantly evicted his own parents just 2 weeks prior. The poetic justice of the moment was absolute. He had absolutely no cash in his pockets, no access to his federally frozen bank accounts, and nowhere to sleep. But the absolute final and most devastating betrayal did not come from the furious billionaire. It came from the vicious woman Colin had desperately tried to impress with my stolen money and my forged engineering license. Brooke had spent her entire life observing her father ruthlessly destroy weak men, and she had learned those brutal corporate lessons with absolute perfection. The very next morning, while Colin was sleeping in a cheap roadside motel he paid for with a borrowed credit card, Brooke initiated her own ruthless survival protocol. She did not call her husband to check on his physical safety or offer him a single shred of emotional comfort. At exactly 9 a.m, she walked into the downtown luxury offices of the most aggressive and expensive family law attorney in the entire city. Brooke formally filed for an expedited absolute divorce. She legally cited irreconcilable differences and profound emotional distress. But her true motivation was pure, calculated self-preservation. Her expensive lawyers immediately drafted a massive public statement declaring that she had absolutely zero knowledge of his fraudulent software company or his illegal federal grant applications. By immediately initiating aggressive divorce proceedings and publicly denouncing his actions, she was actively building a massive legal firewall between herself and his impending federal wire fraud charges. She formally requested a total separation of all physical assets and completely threw my son entirely to the federal wolves just to save her own designer lifestyle and keep herself out of a federal penitentiary. Colin woke up completely alone in a freezing cheap motel room, entirely destitute, facing a mandatory federal prison sentence and officially discarded by the vicious woman he had sacrificed his own loyal parents to please. It took exactly 3 days for the arrogant technology visionary to completely run out of options. The heavy rain was pounding against the single small window of our third-floor motel room when the violent knocking began. Diane was sitting at the laminate table reading a paperback novel. She looked up at the heavy metal door with a sudden flash of panic in her eyes. I placed my hand gently on her shoulder and told her to stay exactly where she was. I walked over to the door and looked through the small glass peephole. Standing on the exterior concrete walkway, soaking wet and shivering violently in the freezing rain, was my son. He was still wearing the exact same expensive velvet tuxedo jacket he had worn to his lavish housewarming party, but it was now torn at the shoulder and heavily stained with dark mud. His perfectly styled hair was plastered against his forehead, and his face was pale and drawn. He looked absolutely pathetic. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt and slowly pulled the door open. I did not invite him inside the warm room. I stood squarely in the doorway, physically blocking his entry. Colin did not try to push his way past me. The absolute second the door opened, his knees completely buckled. He collapsed directly onto the wet concrete floor of the outdoor walkway and grabbed the fabric of my trousers with his freezing hands. He began to weep with the loud, uncontrollable, gasping sobs of a terrified child. He looked up at me with water streaming down his bruised face and begged me to save him. He told me that his entire life was completely over. He cried that Brooke had officially served him with expedited divorce papers that very morning and had legally frozen his only remaining credit card. He whimpered that Gordon had physically thrown him out into the street and blacklisted him from every single corporate office in the city. But the divorce and the immediate poverty were not the real reasons he was sobbing on my shoes. He completely buried his face against my legs and confessed that 2 federal agents from the Department of Justice had visited his cheap roadside motel just an hour ago. They had formally confiscated his phone, his laptop, and his passport. He was officially facing multiple federal indictments for aggravated identity theft and massive wire fraud. He gripped my trousers tighter and begged me to call the federal investigators. He pleaded with me to tell the authorities that I had actually given him verbal permission to use my engineering seal and that the entire situation was just a massive misunderstanding between a father and his son. He promised that if I just retracted my official statement, he would spend the absolute rest of his life making it up to me. He swore he would get a real job, pay back every single dollar of my retirement money, and be the devoted, respectful son I always wanted. I stood in the freezing rain, looking down at the broken boy sobbing at my feet. I did not feel a single drop of parental compassion. A master engineer knows that a structure built entirely on lies cannot ever be salvaged. I looked at his shaking hands, and I remembered the exact cold, arrogant smirk he wore when he handed me a 24-hour eviction notice on my own driveway. He was not crying because he felt genuine remorse for throwing his elderly mother out into the cold winter air. He was only crying because his massive fraudulent empire had collapsed, and he was finally facing the absolute terrifying consequences of his own boundless greed. He did not want genuine forgiveness. He wanted a human shield to absorb his federal prison sentence. I reached down and firmly grabbed his wrists. I pried his freezing fingers off my trousers and stepped back away from him. I told him that the federal government does not drop felony wire fraud charges just because a terrified boy apologizes to his father. I told him that his actions had permanent, irreversible consequences and that I was absolutely not going to commit federal perjury to save a parasite from the prison cell he built with his own 2 hands. I turned away from the freezing rain and walked back into the warmth of the motel room, leaving him kneeling helplessly on the wet concrete. I did not close the heavy metal door right away. I walked over to the small laminate table, where I had neatly arranged a specific set of legal documents my attorney Gavin Pierce had carefully prepared for me the previous afternoon. I picked up the thick manila folder and walked slowly back to the open doorway. Colin looked up at me with a sudden desperate glimmer of hope shining in his swollen red eyes. He genuinely thought I had gone inside to retrieve my winter coat or my truck keys to drive him to safety. He desperately thought the heavy folder in my hands contained a formal legal retraction or some magical solution to his massive federal problem. I looked down at him and completely extinguished that final pathetic delusion. I dropped the manila folder directly onto the wet concrete right in front of his shivering hands. I told him those were absolutely not federal pardons. They were the finalized absolute property reclamation documents. I explained in a cold, steady voice that because his limited liability company was now hopelessly entangled in a massive federal wire fraud investigation, the fraudulent quitclaim deed he had tricked me into signing was legally and permanently voided. I was officially taking my home back. He stared at the thick folder as the freezing rain began to completely soak through the heavy paper. I told him he had exactly 1 hour to retrieve his ridiculous velvet tuxedo jackets and his expensive leased sports car from my driveway before I had them legally impounded and completely crushed for scrap metal. Colin opened his mouth, but a pathetic, choking sob was the absolute only sound he could produce. He reached out with a trembling hand, completely unable to process the total, absolute loss of his stolen empire. I looked at the boy I had raised and delivered my absolute final structural assessment of his ruined life. I told him that a tearful apology is a completely useless tool when a massive foundation has already catastrophically collapsed. I explained that he could cry and beg and promise to be a better, respectful son for the rest of his natural life. But the United States government simply does not care about private family reconciliations. The Federal Bureau of Investigation absolutely does not drop massive felony wire fraud charges just because a terrified young man finally feels remorse for stealing from his elderly parents. I told him that he had built his entire life on a massive, fragile foundation of arrogance and greed, and now he was going to spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary paying the absolute physical price for his own structural failures. I did not reach down to offer him a final comforting hug. I did not tell him that I loved him or that everything would eventually be okay. I looked directly into his terrified, weeping eyes, and I told him that he was absolutely no longer my son. He was simply a catastrophic hazard that I had successfully and permanently removed from my property. I stepped backward into the quiet warmth of my room and pulled the heavy metal door completely shut. I turned the thick brass deadbolt with a loud, definitive click, permanently severing the toxic bloodline and leaving him entirely alone in the freezing dark. 2 days after I closed the heavy metal door of the motel, the massive federal freeze on our property was officially lifted for the rightful owners. Gavin Pierce had executed the legal reclamation with his usual terrifying efficiency. The fraudulent limited liability company was entirely dissolved, and the deed was safely back in my name. I drove my heavy work truck up the familiar concrete driveway under a clear winter sky. The luxury sports cars were permanently gone. The loud, arrogant music was gone. The entire 4,000-square-foot house was completely silent. I walked up the front steps with Diane holding my arm. She was no longer the weeping, broken woman I had found standing at the front gate holding a single overnight bag. She walked with her head held high, completely insulated by the absolute security I had restored. Before we even unpacked our modest bags, I called a private security firm. Within an hour, a team of technicians arrived and completely stripped out the old smart home system my son had installed. They replaced every single brass lock on the doors and installed a heavily encrypted local security network that could never be accessed remotely. The physical perimeter was permanently secured against any future parasites. That evening, Diane and I sat together on the back porch, looking out over the quiet suburban yard. We drank hot coffee and watched the winter sun slowly set behind the massive oak trees I had planted 3 decades ago. We did not speak about the boy who used to live in the upstairs master bedroom. We did not mourn the loss of our only child or the vicious daughter-in-law who had tried to bury us. Those people were simply ghosts caught in a federal machine of their own making. I spent 40 years of my life building massive structures designed to withstand catastrophic failure. But the most important structural lesson I ever learned was that you cannot ever build a peaceful life on a rotten foundation of toxic family loyalty. True family is absolutely not determined by shared blood. It is determined by shared respect and unwavering loyalty. I lost a treacherous son, but I preserved my dignity, my home, and my absolute peace of mind. The foundation is strong again, and this time it will never crack. Thank you for listening to my story today, and remember to always protect your own foundation.